I didn't really start off to write a new translation of the Psalms. It started as a personal project and as a spiritual project. And I wanted to get closer to the meaning of the Psalms. I had, I guess you could say, a real spiritual hunger, and I felt I had an intuition that in the Psalms I would find something of the relationship to God that I was looking for. So I would translate the psalm that spoke to me on a given day, and then I found I had translated so many of them that I wound up continuing the project. So if I were to sit down and think, what should I translate? What would be a good project? Obviously, the Psalms would not be the first to come to mind because they have been translated so many times. But I do find that translations differ fairly considerably, and mine differs from others. The great thing about the Psalms is that they address really the whole spectrum of human emotion, from intense despair and feelings of abandonment by God, feelings of betrayal by humankind, fear of mortality, to great joy and jubilance. And so I love that about the Psalms. And I translated, in different days, some, one or the other of those emotions spoke to me most strongly. And so I would gravitate toward that psalm. First of all, I think there are different kinds of religious speech. There's the kind of top-down speech, thou shalt not, or thou shalt, these sort of ideals of religious behavior. You should love your neighbor as yourself. For Christians, turn the other cheek. These are hard things to live up to. The Psalms, I think, speak to us because they are human speech, addressed to or in the context of God, and they begin right in the place where, in the experience of the speaker. And so they address, and they, even though they are written in a particular context, or sometimes they make reference to the life of David, their parameters are general enough that they include all of us, and they give us vehicles to express our own longing for God. I began the translation at a very dark time in my life. I came to religion as an adult, really as an act of desperation. I felt I needed to believe in something, and I struggled with depression, and so when I first started translating the Psalms, I had a dog, and I would go for long walks with my dog, and I'd bring a book of Psalms, and I just sort of I would read them, trying to take from them spiritual sustenance. And I think many people have approached the Psalms during dark times, or, as you say, difficult times in their lives. To my mind, anger at God is a part of religious life. Religious life is always a trajectory. It's a way of orienting oneself toward God. And sometimes that manifests as anger or fear or feelings of betrayal. That's all part of the journey of religious life, to my mind. But many translations of the Psalms have been sponsored by different religious denominations. So the King James Version, brings to the translation a concern for the divine right of kings, which, of course, was a concern for King James. And so I felt, as somewhat of an outsider, I felt more freedom in terms of approaching the Psalms in the way that I actually read them. And sometimes that was really, like in Psalm 39, for instance, the last line, which is very difficult Hebrew and open to interpretation, but ultimately, as I read the entire psalm, it struck me that this is a psalm where the psalmist is saying, I am getting ready to walk away from you. You know, my interaction with you brings only pain and sorrow. You know, answer me before I leave. And to me, that's religious speech. As I say, you know, I approached it during a dark time, a time where the darkness felt unrelenting. You know, I didn't see an easy way out. And so that kind of just throwing your hands up and crying out to God resonated with me very deeply. You know, the Psalms are full of longing for God, you know, a longing to experience God more intimately, more immediately. And I think that's part of why they appeal to people, and certainly appeal to me, because you know, once you embark on I've always been astonished by this phrase or this way of articulating faith as something you have or you don't have. You know, it's like you're a person of faith or you're a person. You know, faith is really a journey, a yearning. In Hebrew, you often have an abstract idea coupled with a very physical image in the same word, like the word rachamim, which means compassion, comes from rechem, which means womb. You know, and so there's a kind of muscularity, I would say, to the Psalms, a muscularity to the language, and a sense of groundedness in the physical world that is very beautiful. And the Psalms also, some of them are clearly meant to be used for liturgical purposes. You know, they have repeating phrases, and the way they are written is very musical. So to capture that in English, you know, involved some work and some wrestling. The Psalms that praise God are also important. I think sometimes people forget about those because so many of us turn to Psalms in dark times, but there is this incredible joy and ecstasy, really, in the Psalms also. And that is an important aspect of the Psalms because it situates joy within the context of a relationship with God, which makes joy more than simply moments of happiness within a person's life, but it sort of gives joy a more of an eternal context. And I love those Psalms as well. Really, the ending of the book of Psalms is a crescendo of praise. You know, the very last Psalm, Psalm 150, is, even in the way that it's chanted in some religious context and Jewish context, it's a crescendo of praise, and it's about praising God through all the instruments, through all aspects of, you know, humanity. So the Psalms speak to distance from God in all sorts of contexts, but one of those contexts is very much a sense of, you know, physical suffering, of torment. And I spent a year in rabbinical school, and as part of that year, I worked in a hospital as a chaplain. And so the Psalms are very important to people who are suffering, because illness can leave us feeling very distant and cut off from God. And for people to feel that there's a way to talk to God even from those periods of intense, almost unbearable torment, was very transformative. The Psalms are very much concerned with justice, while at the same time looking around the world and seeing the injustice of the world and crying out to God, saying, God, you who created the heavens and earth, why can't you create justice on earth? Why are the poor suffering? Why is there so much suffering in the world? And so the Psalms have been used over the years by those struggling for justice in various ways. I think some Christians read the Psalms as pointing to or prefiguring the coming of Jesus. But I think mostly for Christians, the Psalms represent exactly what they do for Jews, which is the person of faith standing up in relation to God in a very honest and genuine way. And I think in that way they speak to all of us.